critical minerals actually are, the way I like to describe them, it's little tiny elements that are in your modern technology. Take your phone, for example, right? There's a battery inside here that has lithium, cobalt, nickel, and manganese, and that's the same battery that's in the computer that you're using right now. And it's not just consumer technology, it's also the missiles, the drones. When you get on an airplane, that airplane body is made up of titanium. The jet engines are made up of cobalt. The problem is that these critical minerals are everywhere, but when you break down and see where the critical minerals are coming from, they're really coming from China. So China has the chokehold on the processing of all these critical minerals. At Silverado, we're developing this mineral trade defense pack. So it would be like a critical mineral club on the trade side, plus having some sort of like retaliatory measures with our partners if China were to come and do more export controls or bans on us. Like an attack on us is an attack on all. That is under the NATO framework. Again, domestic production is the long game, the trade policy is the short game, because once they get the know-how for that, they're going to move light years ahead. They'll be totally vertically integrated. All the processed inputs there with the semiconductor, chips, both on the foundational and advanced chips, and they will just steamroll ahead. They kind of lament like that they believe in free trade, and I always kind of laugh at that because
Right.
it's like you believe in free trade, but what you do is entirely subsidized, so you're not on the same level playing field.
We have very different viewpoints on many things.
But a lot of these issues are American issues. They're not Republican or Democrat issues.
Welcome back to Elevated Thoughts, the show that's working to restore productive discourse between left and right. I'm your host, Cooper. Of course, I'm joined by my co-host and producer, Mike. And today we have the privilege of discussing an extremely important topic with an absolute expert. Mahnaz Khan is a former U.S. government trade expert and now the VP of Policy for Critical Supply Chains at the Silverado Policy Accelerator, actually owned by one of our former guests, Dmitry Alperovich. Mahnaz, thank you for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming on. We are really excited to speak with you because this is such an interesting issue that we've been talking with a lot of experts about: the economy, supply chains, trade relations, all of the above. But now we feel like we get to dive a little bit more into the weeds, or should I say the mines maybe, of what exactly are critical minerals. So can you just start a little bit by telling us about yourself, how you got into this role, what your credentials are maybe, and yeah, what are critical minerals?
Sure. Thanks, Cooper. So I'm Manas. I am, as you said, the VP of Policy at Silverado. I spent 14 years in government at all three trade agencies. So hopped around from the Department of Commerce. That was during 2010, the first Obama administration, and then the U.S. International Trade Commission, which is an independent bipartisan commission. And then lastly at USTR, which is part of the White House. So after doing all that, there's nowhere to go. No, just kidding. I decided to do something different and went over to Silverado. So what's great about Silverado is all the senior staff have worked at the agencies I've just named. And so we all think alike on these issues as former government insiders, and we bring a really unique perspective in terms of we can speak the same language as the people in the administration and on the Hill on these issues. We're not very pie in the sky kind of, dreamy ideas kind of people. We're very practical in that sense. So it's been great. I'll admit, I came into the role about 15 months ago and I had no idea what a critical mineral was. So just don't tell my boss. And she took me, I take over the critical minerals portfolio. And I was great. You know, uh, I thought I was going to do diamonds and gold and, all that. So had no idea. But found out that critical minerals actually are, the way I like to describe them, it's little tiny elements that are in your modern technology, right? Everything that you're using. And so to a layperson, like take your phone, for example, right? There's a battery inside here that has lithium, cobalt, nickel, and manganese, and that's the same battery that's in the computer that you're using right now. The touch screen here, right, when you're touching it, that has indium. That's another critical mineral. And you guys look like you take a lot of selfies. And so that camera lens here is made up of lanthanum. And the camera quality is also made up of different types of rare earths. And these little tiny AirPods, right? You take them out inside, there's a little sound in here. Those are made up of little rare earth magnets that you put in your
Right,
ear. By
right.
the way, these are not waterproof. This is my fourth pair that I bought in the past week. So I see the world in critical minerals, and it's not just consumer technology. It's also the missiles, the drones. When you get on an airplane, that airplane body is made up of titanium. The jet engines are made up of cobalt, um, tantalum, you name it, right? So the problem is that these critical minerals are everywhere, but when you break down and see where the critical minerals are coming from, they're really coming from China. So China has, the chokehold on the processing of all these critical minerals, and that's really why you're hearing about it in the news and you're hearing about it everywhere now, is because we're realizing how exposed we are to China on on these tiny little minerals that power everything that we have.
So I want to go back a little bit because most folks don't know what a lot of these agencies do. It just sounds like alphabet soup to them. So could you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit difference in like the roles between what the commission does, the trade rep, et cetera? Because they all have similar goals but different functions in what they do.
Yeah, so Department of Commerce is the biggest trade agency. I think it's about 3,000 folks. And they have different functions. They work, I was in the enforcement and compliance section, so looking at trade cases back in the day. They also do a lot of international engagement. So you'll see foreign service officers all over the world. They're part of the Department of Commerce. So think about that as the big giant trade animal. And so they have a lot of different types of functions. Now, I went to a smaller agency. I kept going to smaller and smaller agencies. The U.S. International Trade Commission, I would say they are more the ivory tower academics. They do a lot of industry analysis. They're very respected on the Hill and with the administration. So both the Hill and the White House send reports or requests to the U.S. International Trade Commission asking them, can you look at this economic analysis before we go and make this trade agreement? What would be the effect? So Commerce and USTR are on opposite sides of the White House. I like to say ITC is a little bit removed, and they're a little bit removed from the politics of it all. And I spent about 10 years there. So I was a subject matter expert. I was doing steel, aluminum, apparel, trade agreements, you name it. So was used to that type of work. Then USTR is part of the White House. They're the hard-nosed trade negotiators, and they do a fantastic job on that. They're the ones that where the tariffs are coming out of. So they are really boots on the ground. They're tinier than the U.S. ITC. The U.S. International Trade Commission is about 400 people. The U.S. Trade Representative is about 250. So all different functions, but all very relevant to the trade space. Each has their role. So I respect them all and have friends that all three of them.
Over the last couple weeks or months, we've talked to a bunch of different experts specifically about China. And one of the people we spoke with was Eric Olander, who runs the China Global South Project. And coming off of the heels of interviewing Dimitri, thinking, oh my gosh, he even corrected me when I said we're in a competition with China. He said, no, no, don't use that word. It's much more severe.
Yeah.
Then we interviewed Eric Olander, and he explained, well, he lives in Vietnam, he travels and loves China, he's seen all of their advancements, and he studies their rhetoric, I'll say, and kind of explained and how no, they have a very defensive posture, unlike what we were kind of expecting him to say. They have not invested a disparate amount in their military as compared to their size of their economy. And they really are kind of acting in their interests, and that's okay. It's the same as anyone else might. And he made me feel a lot more dovish, might I say, towards China after that. So when you say that most of our critical minerals are coming out of China, it leads me to think, okay, well, that's not so bad, right? A lot of our stuff comes out of China, our manufacturing, all of that.
Yeah.
Is it a problem that our critical mineral, that the world's critical mineral supply is coming out of China?
So for this supply chain, it is, and I'll tell you why. So we started, and there are different angles to the China issue. So if you look at China's Made in 2025 initiative, China really wants to gain leverage on us in certain sectors, and they lay out 10 sectors. Some of those are AI, automation, robotics, all the sectors that you need critical minerals and semiconductors as well. And we have the semiconductor design and know-how to make those chips. And, that's why we're ahead of China and in the sectors that they want to be ahead of. And they have this grand plan, right? So back in 2019 to 2022, we started putting semiconductor export controls on our equipment so that China couldn't get that technology because they want it. If they get that technology, then they will be ahead of us by leaps and bounds, and they have all the inputs to be ahead of us, right? So that was problematic. So China started retaliating back in 2023, and they started putting export controls on us for germanium and gallium initially, and then rare earths processing technology, and then they put another export control on us for antimony. Then what they did back in December is they put what they call dual use export controls on a number of critical minerals. What we did, and that was December 1st. So then December 2nd, we put a export control again on them for advanced semiconductor equipment. December 3rd, they struck back really hard and put down export bans on antimony, germanium, and gallium. This was different though, because they only imposed the bans on the United States. And so that was direct retaliation. And then some people kind of lost track, but over the holidays, they started putting a lot of the US defense companies on their unreliable entity list. So they started blocking us because we blocked them. So we're kind of in this spot right now. They put more export controls, extended those export controls on a number of other minerals back in February on tungsten, bismuth, indium as well. So we're just in this tit for tat. This was all before, or right after Trump came. So we were not even talking about tariffs imposed at the moment. So, you know,
That
that's
just complicates everything
yeah,
even more.
it's almost like a zero sum game, right? So in order for them to win, they have to take away something from us, and they're on track to become the largest semiconductor producers. In 2 years, they will outpace Taiwan and Korea, which are the top two. And that's
Oh,
just
wow.
at the status quo right now. So that's how we look at it from these supply chains. We're not at Silverado, we're not lovey-dovey about it. We're like, pay attention and look at these. And we've done extensive amount of analysis on the critical minerals to see which ones where we're gonna be hit next. Um,
See, so
on this
now
one.
there's an issue though, is because the supply chain isn't just because China is rich in the supply of these rare earth minerals, right? It has more to do with the fact of market manipulation over the last several years, and it also has to do with also not just recent tit for tat retaliations, but I know this goes back years and years ago. So every time any kind of the other supply or producers around the world try to open up, I think China kind of uses their hand to tip the scales towards their favor. Is that right?
Yeah, so I can explain the rare earth story. And so and this has been going on for a really long time. We're talking about like the 1980s.
Right.
So we were actually the leader. The United States was the leader in rare earths production in the Mountain Pass, California mine back in the 80s. And then we were kind of neck and neck with China. So in 1992, the Chinese president, I'm not going to try to say his name, I'm so bad with Chinese names, but he said the Middle East has oil and China has rare earths. So they understood their advantage in rare earths and they started processing and developing it. But they did it obviously without real environmental laws, with, using problematic labor standards, and obviously their subsidies, right? So
Mhm.
they gained an advantage on us. They put the United States rare earths mine out of business by 1998. So think about it. We had the advantage in the 80s, early 90s, and then they just came in swinging and took that advantage away from us. And there's been fits and starts. That Mountain Pass mine, I think, there's been a lot of government support of our rare earths industry. We actually have the second largest rare earths reserve in the world. Um, and so we're in a good position there. I call rare earths like our the big great hope, the great big mineral hope, right? Because we can get there, but we have to make sure the government policies align. And what most people don't know is we've been very heavily reliant on China for for rare earths, I think a couple years now, I would say over the last 10 years, we've been net import reliant over 95%. But in 2024, that dropped to 80%. So a lot of people haven't picked up on that. And that's really because that Mountain Pass mine, MP Materials, is making the rare earths, processing the rare earths, making the rare earths metal now, which is what we used to import from China and is going into the magnets. So they understand the whole full value chain of the rare earths from the metal, to the refining to the magnets. And that's really how we should be tackling this problem, not just the minerals, but the whole value chain. And so I'd see that as a success story at the point we are now, but we still need the government policies to support that and make sure that it doesn't take us 30 years to get our production back, right? And a lot of these other minerals in the United States, they weren't in that position where we had production and then we lost it. We've never had production or processing here.
Very interesting. It's making me think back to when I read Chris Miller's book, Chip War, and it kind of goes through the history in the 50s, 60s, and 70s of how we were making the chips as best we could here. And all of a sudden, Morris Chang went to Taiwan, created TSMC, and the Americans kind of said, screw it, we're not making them here anymore.
Yeah.
I imagine in the 80s, it was something along those lines where they said, you know what, they're able to refine it, let them do it, and we'll bring it back here. There's not really an issue with that. And
Yeah.
now, as things continue to heat up and the global superpower power rankings are coming into question, I think we're saying, hey, this decoupling needs to become more serious. So, I guess my question would be, does the United States, I know Trump will always say it, and I don't know if he's joking or being hyperbolic, but we have the black gold underneath our feet, enough of it to power the world. Do we have the rare earth and the critical minerals here on the continental United States enough to decouple from China on this important stuff?
I was at a conference just yesterday and I was listening to Senator Murkowski from Alaska. And she was saying there's 50 critical minerals, right? And Alaska has 49 of them.
Wow.
But then she noted, so we do have it here, but then she noted, there's no road in Alaska to get to
Right.
that mine. And it takes a lot of power and a lot of infrastructure to get that out. So it's not necessarily that do we have it here? It's can we get it out of the ground? Do we have the infrastructure to support it? And is it economically feasible to get it out of the ground? And is it economically feasible to process and be competitive with China? So you have a lot of
Mm.
factors there.
And in 10 years, you may not use those materials anymore.
Yeah, that's the other thing, right? Like everybody in this industry talks about certainty and guarantees, and it's hard because you don't have a certainty on price. You don't have
Mhm.
because China keeps undercutting on price. You don't have a certainty on supply. There's a lot of dynamics that happen, and I will say, and I think this gets lost, every single critical mineral has its own supply chain and its own
Right.
dynamics, right? We're talking about 50 different critical minerals. So you have to look at it mineral by mineral, which is difficult for sometimes policymakers to even understand.
Talk to us a little bit about regions like Africa, South America, when we look at China's Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, it sounds like what we just mentioned in Alaska, building infrastructure to access these minerals and get them back to us. Is that not what the Belt and Road is doing? I mean, I guess China's thinking a little differently about this.
Yeah, and I can speak to it more broadly. So, with the rare earths example, China had the rare earths within their borders, right? And they developed it. With other regions, what we see is a pattern of China going in and taking out the minerals from a particular region and then sending it over to China for processing. So I'll give you an example for cobalt. All right. Cobalt is very plentiful in the DRC. The DRC makes up about 75% of the mine production for cobalt. So huge player. Now, China went in there early and decided to buy up all the mines. So now they account for 80% of the mines in the DRC. So crazy, right? Like you're talking about that. With cobalt, there's other dynamics. It's not just the China dynamic. You also have this one company, CMOC, that is Chinese owned, and they oversupplied the market. So they started producing cobalt twice the output that is needed. So the DRC most recently stepped in and had an export ban of cobalt. That was in February, so they imposed a 4-month export ban. And some reports said the price dropped to a 100-year low. So I haven't fact check that, but, talk about, like, the Chinese oversupplying, and that affects the local population and everything like that. Then there's another dynamic which doesn't necessarily affect, Cobalt, but there is the Rwandan M23 rebels at the border,
Right.
and that just leads to more instability in the DRC generally, and so a lot of companies and investors don't necessarily wanna come and set up shop there. So what we are seeing in Africa with this new administration is the DRC approaching this administration asking for a mineral for security agreement because they feel like that's the way to engage. They saw it worked with Ukraine, so they're looking to us. And I don't want to get too much into the politics, but I just want to note that as an emerging model that Africa may see that as a way of engagement in the United States. So in Africa, we have a lot of dynamics, but generally in Africa, we see China coming in and really, going country by country and taking up the resources. And they do it from the mine. They own the railways, they own all the ports, and then they ship it out from the ports that they own all the way back to their country and they process, right? So they take out the value added component from those countries and they do it again in a very dirty way, not, with real strong labor standards, and they take the value added part and then export it all over the world.
Sure, and then
Now,
there's the we can go into the debt trap too, but that's
yeah.
probably part of a larger conversation that's part of their strategy.
Yeah.
We just recently dropped our monikers here. We used to go by our nicknames here. I was Recycle Mike. I come from the electronics recycling industry, so something we talk about is like supply chain security and ethics within the supply chain. Cobalt is one of the big ones, obviously. But there's always this, push to try to advance the conversation. Well, how can we do it in more ethical areas, either more developed nations with secure supply chains, or how do we do it domestically? So my question to you would be: is how does the U.S. start bringing some of these systems online? Because at least from my perspective, I work in environmental compliance in permitting and stuff like that. NIMBY is a big part of it, right? Like not in my backyard. So what kind of frameworks
Yeah.
can we utilize to try to bring some domestic or at least friend shoring, as they say, some of this production?
Do you mean within the United States or
Yeah, within the United States, and then what other, global strategies we might have with some of our partners.
Yeah, so for I think domestically, again, I was at this conference for the last 2 days. What's interesting is that a lot of the companies that are producing or mining or trying to process, they engage with the stakeholders and the indigenous tribes very early. So I think that's a good model, even before they get the permits. They want to make sure that the community has buy-in, and I think that's really an important model. That's not a model that necessarily China does when they go into these other
Right.
countries, right? So, like, I think that's a really good model, not just to engage in the United States, but also abroad. So that's one. And I think, in the United States, we do have a lot of permitting and environmental standards. And, the reason it takes such a long time is because of all the regulations and all that we have to protect the people, right? And other countries know that, and that's why they see us as responsible business partners. And I used to work in South Asia issues in at USTR, so these countries want us to come in. They don't really want to do business with the Chinese because they know that there's a cost to doing business with the Chinese. But sometimes, again, like, they feel like they have no choice if we're not engaging or they're not attracting up investment from other responsible partners, such as partners in Europe or Japan or Australia, etcetera. So, on the trade policy front, I think that there needs to be an understanding that we can't it there are very, very long permitting timelines in the United States. It takes
Right.
about 15 to 30 years, right? So, how I see this play out is that on the US mining front, that's the long game, right? We
Sure.
have to develop that. We can't not develop that here, but you're talking a very long game. When you're talking about engaging with partners, that's more of a short game because that the mining's already being done in a lot of these countries, especially in Africa and the
Sure.
lithium triangle in South America, right? So we can't ignore that because the Chinese are already there. And at Silverado, we've been tracking like countries that are at risk for Chinese investment. And they're all over the map. You're talking about, China has already bought up all the bauxite mills in Jamaica and Guyana. They've bought up a lot of the lithium, in Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, and this is in our own hemisphere.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
we need to really make those partnerships, and there's different models to do it, but we can't keep our eye off the ball, um, on that front.
So we recently interviewed our last two guests who are releasing the book Command of Commerce, which is about these levers that the United States can pull if things go heat up with China, with our allies. So one thing they explained is how important it is to work bilaterally with our allies in Europe and really Europe, actually, is I think how they explained it, to sanction or export control or treat China similarly so they are kind of decoupled, isolated, and we maintain our advantage with all of our allies. What I wanted to ask is who are our allies in this game? Who are the ones that we are going to lean on, if not China? Because it sounds like they're the ones that are running the show here. And the only way out of this is to create new infrastructure. Is there anywhere on Earth that's already set up to do this that we can kind of plug into?
I think it's gonna require some creative thinking on this front, and I can tell you that Silverado's been doing a lot of work on the trade policy front for these critical minerals. So if you think about the trade policy front, let's say we have trade here and defense here, so on a spectrum, right? And there are what we say bilateral critical mineral agreements are the first one within a trade um, lane, and that's partner to partner. So there's been one critical mineral agreement that has gone through, and that's the U.S. Japan critical mineral agreement, and that was in under the Biden administration that came out in March 2023. And the Biden administration was well intentioned in trying to do other critical mineral agreements. They tried to do it with, they made the intention known that they wanted to do one with the EU, with the UK, and then with Indonesia. And then when there was that announcement with Indonesia, Congress balked. And they were like, wait, wait, wait. You want to do a critical minerals agreement with Indonesia? They're like, there's Chinese investment all over the Indonesia nickel supply chain. And we've done some research and found that there's about 75% to 90% Chinese involvement in the Indonesian nickel mines. And the process that the Chinese have introduced to get this nickel into battery grade nickel is very dirty. It's led to deforestation. It's led to biodiversity loss. It's led to, health risks in the community. So they were like, why would we do an agreement and basically give it to the Chinese? They didn't meet our labor standards. And then Congress also said, you didn't consult with us. So all those agreements in the Biden administration, kind of, those bilateral critical agreements were halted. There's also this concept of a critical minerals club, also that would be in the trade defense lane. Sorry, the trade lane. And we saw that kind of in the Biden administration. It was kind of quiet. But in this administration, it says in the trade policy agenda that Trump released that he wanted to do plurilateral sector specific deals. He didn't say critical minerals, but that's kind of an indication that we might see this concept of a critical minerals club come back. And again, that would be in the trade lane. At Silverado, we're developing this mineral trade defense pact. So it would be like a critical mineral club on the trade side, plus having some sort of like retaliatory measures with our partners if China were to come and do more export controls or bans on us. Like an attack on us is an attack on all. That is under the NATO framework. Um, but given the political situation, NATO is probably not the best framework to use at this time. But we're also looking at AUKUS, which is Australia UK framework. We are doing the United States government announced that they will be entering into negotiations with a trade agreement with the UK. So that's very positive. And then the other one is to use the Quad. So the Quad is India, Australia, Japan, and then us. And we have a free trade agreement with Australia. We have a critical mineral agreement with Japan, and the Trump administration just recently announced negotiations for a what do they call it? A multi-sector bilateral trade agreement with India. So I got the trade pieces there. So that might be a framework that worked. And then the other model that I noted before is really on the defense side, which is the Mineral for Security Agreement, which is the Ukraine, potentially Congo agreement. Again, I think that one will be difficult to do on a large scale. And with allies, you're really trading minerals for security. So there are frameworks. We haven't seen the signals yet as to what this administration will do. We're looking very closely at this UK and India agreement and seeing if there's other signs. But this executive order that came out was really domestic focused. So we're still awaiting those signs. But it's pretty normal in administration. They first focus on the domestic policies and then they move on to trade policy a little bit later. So when people are like, well, what's this administration doing on Africa and everything? I'm like, just take a pause. They will do something, we just need to wait and see. But right now, the focus is on the domestic production piece of it.
I think Indonesia is a microcosm of kind of China's behavior on the global stage. There are many maneuvers that they do that are just simply either defensive or just for focusing on their own personal interests, their national interests. But then there are other actions that are very adversarial and they don't always seem that way at first. But I think Indonesia is a good point of that and their infiltration kind of into the nickel sector there. Then you mentioned some other countries, the lithium triangle in South America. So, what are some other ways that China is secretly moving into these supply chains and kind of control them? Where are some other locations maybe that haven't been mentioned, or like we can kind of juxtapose the U.S. is unfortunately I don't want to say pulling back or withdrawing, but perhaps we can kind of contrast where China is making foreign investments and where the U.S. isn't.
I think those are the 3 big ones that we've been tracking at Silverado is really in Africa. They're all over Africa. They're, besides a lithium triangle, they're also buying up a lot of niobium in Brazil as well. I mentioned the bauxite in Jamaica and Guyana, which are the 2 largest, sources of bauxite. And at Silverado, we've been trying to track if they're buying up and investing in these markets to have a backdoor into the US market. And it hasn't been clear. It looks like they're buying for their own domestic supply or to change the dynamics globally. It's hard to know what they're really doing, what their real aim is, because some for the bauxite, they're trying to send that, back to their country for processing it because they have their own
Right.
development needs as well. So it's difficult to track as to what they're exactly doing, but they influence so much of that global supply eh, chain and the pricing dynamics. And they, even in countries that, even outside of their borders, which is, in the case of the DRC, they're able to overproduce and then drop the price so much and affect an entire country. It's crazy.
They're so good at that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
And our,
they've
our supply chain too.
Sure.
Yeah.
They've run ramshackle over the World Trade Organization, but then they also have the audacity at the same time to use it against the US to open up cases. Have you been following a little bit of that recently?
They they kind of lament like that they believe in free trade, and I always kind of laugh at that because
Right.
it's like you believe in free trade, but what you do is entirely subsidized, so you're not on the same level playing field. And so they're playing a whole different set of with a whole different set of rules and then like disguising it as free trade, which it's not. When you go into countries and you don't pay fair wages or you don't care, like in Indonesia, they use this high pressure acid leaching process. They don't care about the local people and what that does to the environmental impact. Then you're not a very good actor, so I don't really and countries are smart, like these developing countries, they're smart to that.
Right.
And some of them, and I will give them credit, I'm not gonna name names, but that they don't want, China there, but, sometimes they wanna also develop too, so they feel like they don't have a choice. And Indonesia is also getting smart. They are trying to knock out some of this Chinese investment within their own country after seeing the effects of what happened, and the cost of the cost of advancement, um, because of the Chinese.
So
Hmm.
it's a tool that they wield often, this product dumping or supply dumping, because it's not just critical minerals or rare earths that do it. It's doing it as well with finished goods, and you might see a little bit of a change maybe in the marketplace now with certain tariffs being excised on packages below $800 in value. But the companies like Temu are a perfect example of that, or Primark's another one where they dump cheap goods onto markets and which no domestic suppliers of any kind could support. I mean, is there really anything that we can do against this kind of oversupply or product dumping in the US?
Yeah, we see that obviously in the critical minerals market. With lithium processing, we can't bring that online because the prices are so low. With cobalt, sometimes with nickel, you know, eh, some folks like to use tariffs. I think that's one tool in the toolbox. I also feel like once you put a tariff on, you're subject to a lot of retaliation too. So
Right.
once you do that, I call it chasing the tariff. Right, you have to keep chasing it upward. One tool that I personally like, but you have to use with caution, is the Uyghur Labor. I always get it wrong. UFLPA, Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
Hmm.
And so what that act does is it creates a rebuttable presumption that a certain type of good coming out of China is made with forced labor. So I used to be in the apparel and textiles industry, and so that UFLPA was used in the apparel supply chain. And what happened was the companies had to trace back their entire supply chain all the way from the yarn. And at that time, I think 20 or 25% of the yarn was coming out of the region that was using the forced labor. And so all the companies, they started moving their supply chain out of China and to Bangladesh, India, Mexico, Vietnam, you name it, and it moved the supply chain. And it's easier to move like a sewing machine from one country to
Sure.
another. It's harder to move a processing plant. So, right now we say try to think about imposing the UFLPA on lithium because China's only processing right now about 60%. We can't really get our processing of lithium, started. So once you impose that and you give a longer lead time, let's say 5 years, which is the average time to have a processing plant up and running, and then you have the government supporting the price of that for just that duration, what you're doing is you're creating a UFLPA compliant supply chain, which
Got
hopefully
it.
will be in the United States or with your allies, and you're decoupling it away from China. So you don't allow the companies to use that type of lithium in the supply chain, and we're saying use it. When you're making batteries and stuff, have those type of batteries that are non Chinese origin in the supply chain. We also saw it the same type of provision was used for solar panels, which were also half of them were being made in that region, using forced labor, and that moved the supply chain. And then some of it came back to the United States, very little, but it moved to like other countries outside of China as well. So that's one way. If you mandate it out of the supply chain, then you're not worried about imposing higher and higher tariffs. You're just not making it an option.
Right.
So
I'm thinking to like on X, I'll get fed a video every once in a while of working conditions in a cobalt mine or a lithium mine, and I see videos like that, and I think to myself, "Oh, these are terrible conditions." But and correct me if I'm wrong, Manas, but it sounds like you're saying that the Chinese-owned mines or the Chinese-owned firms are the ones that are kind of orchestrating this bad working conditions. But when I've seen this, I've always kind of perceived it as, oh, that's the Congo. They don't have work. They need to do this. They don't care if they don't have shoes. I mean, is it somewhere in the middle? Is it the Chinese are coming in? We need to cut a buck. We need to do whatever we can to get this done. Or is it like, oh no, this is just the working conditions we have here in the DRC. This is just how it works.
yeah,
Can you help me understand that?
yeah. I used to do a lot of labor for Bangladesh in the apparel supply chain, but I haven't like gone very far deeply into the labor issue. On the cobalt. The cobalt, it is an issue. The Department of Labor put, cobalt and DRC on their, like, worst forms of forced labor list
Right.
most recently, so it's definitely a problem that this government has recognized. And to say, I mean, China's, again, 80% of the mines are there, so they can't say that they're not the ones that are perpetuating it when they own all the mines. So I think there's a linkage, but I haven't done, like, crazy amount of research into it. All I know is that it's on our government list as very problematic now and getting a lot more attention on this front. There's a lot of dynamics in the labor supply chain, but I will say overall, China's not the best. They don't have the best track record.
Yeah, well,
Their
you
own
can't
country
argue
alone.
yeah, you can't argue 80% ownership. I mean, we post clips of our show on TikTok, and a lot of the comments we get are Western propaganda. You guys are Western propaganda, fear mongers. So I guess what I'd be curious to ask you is, is the United States perceived? Because I'm sure if you go to the Middle East and you ask, "What do you think about the United States?" You get a certain type of answer. Um, in these countries that have the critical mineral supplies in South America, in Southeast Asia or Africa, are we also seen as like, oh my gosh, well, we get to choose the bitter apple or the poison apple? I'm not sure that the United States is seen as this Captain America valiant hero, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but right, we're also probably buying that same cobalt that is mined unethically. I mean, am I kind of thinking correctly there?
No, I mean, I at Silverado, we used to do a lot of diplomatic roundtables with African countries, Latin American countries and everything, and those those ambassadors and those diplomats that were sitting really wanted the United States in there, and they say that we're really responsible partners. So, for example, like they asked for such simple things from us. They're like, "Can you come in, United States, and help us build our lab facilities? Because we don't even know what we have in the ground, and when the Chinese come in, they say you have nothing in the ground, and they
Right.
know, right? But they have no knowledge of
Mm.
what that is, and they're like, "We don't know if we're being taken advantage of, so United States, can you come and help us and do some testing because we need an objective opinion." So the fact that they're asking for very little, and then they also ask for, "Can you help us with workforce development?" And, how do we unionize and how do we, um get our workers trained up and educated because they understand when we come in, we help the community too, and that we're just not trying to exploit workers. So I keep hearing it from different ambassadors and diplomats, and the fact that and I used to work again in South Asia at USTR, and same kind of thing. Like in Nepal, right? There was that Belt Road Initiative. China came in and made a road, and within 2 years it fell apart. Right?
Right, right, right.
And they had this like crazy loan that they had to repay back the Chinese, and they had to rebuild their own road. And they were begging us, "Can you please come in, United States, and build it right?" Because they know they understand that we're the better actors in this type of in these deals. But we don't come with a bag of cash like the Chinese do.
So within my the electronics recycling industry, like I was saying before, Cobalt was receiving a lot of scrutiny, still does, about the ethics within the supply chain, and obviously a big push of that is not just sourcing it domestically from abroad, but then also increasing circularity. Has there been any kind of movements on not just cobalt but also other rare earths and critical minerals, trying to improve the recovery models and processes in the U.S.?
You probably know that industry better than I do.
I was wondering if
Recycled what?
Silverado had any kind of conversations advancing because what usually happens, and this happens with almost every industrial sector, is there's some pie in the sky solution or
Yeah.
process that's going to do everything, and years languish by, and it's not quite exactly as they promised.
Yeah, so Silverado does a lot of work on the circularity front, and, a lot of kind of the same things we've been saying for a few years. One is, you know, they eh, we send a lot of waste to China, and a lot of those are the batteries, and what happens is it goes as a waste as, like, apparel items and, like, broken auto parts and
Right,
lithium-ion
right,
batteries,
right,
and it all goes over to China. Nobody knows how much is being sent over there. So we're saying have a breakout for these, like, lithium-ion batteries so we know how much we're shipping abroad, and then we'll have a better understanding of what we can keep here. I did a circularity roundtable when I first started the job, and the one thing I kept hearing, and it was with the United States and the EU, is that the economics are not there to take
right.
out the minerals. It's cheaper just to get the minerals. It's cheaper to mine it. And I always say people talk about mining and processing. I'm like, there's actually for me, there's a four-legged stool. It's mining, processing, what we call mineral recovery, and I'll get into that, and innovating, right? Either that's innovating on the recycling side, so it's cheaper to get out the materials from these recycled components, or innovating out of troubled minerals like cobalt, etc.
Right.
So the reason we call it mineral recovery is that that's the new term that this administration is using, and that was in the U.S. India joint leader statement. They said they wanted to do a strategic mineral recovery initiative with India. So we said, okay, that seems to be the new buzzword now. Circularity, recycling doesn't seem to be the buzzword. And we're still looking for signals as to what this administration wants to do on the recycling front. It's interesting because the Trump 1 administration had a lot of emphasis on this recycling circularity piece. So, again, wait and see approach, but hopefully there'll be more incentives to recycle and so we can get that because the way you reduce net import reliance is not just mining and processing at home, it's also recycling at
Right,
home. And
right.
if that point gets lost, and you know that better, Mike, than
Sure.
anybody.
I'm wondering if Silverado is looking for any environmental recycling experts, with a big background. But
Yeah, yeah, we can partner together.
if
For
you ever
sure.
need an elevator consultant, you've got
Yeah,
one here as
right.
well.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Actually, I might reach out to you, Mike, because that's a big area we're getting back into. Because we had our expert, really great expert leave before I joined, and so, um, really trying to get down to the economics of how we do it smarter. And again, I think it's mineral by mineral or, like, battery or end use by end use, right? Like,
Right, right, right.
getting copper out of something, I don't know, maybe it will be cheaper than try to get out lithium or those minerals out of
For
something.
sure, yeah. Lithium and the other minerals, they're a little bit more complex, the chemistries for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
well, Manaz, if you could say one thing that the United States could do tomorrow to push ourselves in the right direction in your eyes in this field, what do you think that would be?
I think in this administration, I think we're on the right track with the domestic production and the mining, the emphasis on that. I think we need to also develop the trade policy, the international partnership side, because we need our partners to get us out of this. There is a way out. I mean, with rare earths, we're seeing positive signs. That was all done domestically, here, but there's a lot of other minerals. Like we don't make tantalum here, right? We need
Right.
partners on that side, but really trying to develop that as quickly as we can. This administration is moving very, very quickly, and I commend them for that. But the trade policy piece really needs to be fleshed out and figuring out who those partners are and having an open mind with that because the minerals are not necessarily where the FTA partners are. The minerals are where they are, right?
Yep.
So I think there needs to be a better accounting of that, and I think we will get there. I think this administration is setting the right signals. Right now, this is not developed, but as I said before, these trade policy options, which way are we going and with which partners? Are we doing the bilateral agreements with the partners? Are we doing the club? Are we doing the trade defense pact? What we need clarity on that front. And I think everybody in the critical minerals policy space is waiting for that clarity. And hopefully we'll get there. And what's great about the critical minerals policy world is that there are no two sides. I was in the apparel and steel industry. There's always two sides, and they're both going at it. Everybody in the critical minerals policy world, we all get along. It's a small policy, where everybody bumps into each other, and we're all trying to move in the same direction with the administration, with the Hill. It's a bipartisan issue. It doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat. We're all heading in the same direction. So
Yeah.
hopefully, we can get there in the next few years.
That's I don't know if you know anything about our show, but that's kind of where we started. Is I'm the right wing pundit and Mike is the left wing pundit. But as we've kind of talked with more and more people, it's been harder sometimes to support some of the actions by the Trump administration. But you said it best that they start with domestic policy, and that's what they've been hammering right now. Soon, the foreign policy is going to come and the trade initiatives, and I think we give them the benefit of the doubt, and they're going to make the right decisions. I found that as much as I might have disliked Joe Biden's actions when he came up with the CHIPS Act, it was aligned with where I thought we needed to go. And now Trump as well has the same mentality. I think that okay, semiconductors, stuff like this, rare earth and critical minerals, this is really important stuff, and it's not something that we can uh, art of the deal our way into making these arrangements, right? It really does need to be nuanced, well thought out, and heavily advised. So we at this side of the table are very grateful to have people like you looking at it and understanding it and trying to come up with solutions because it is scary to think, yeah, we're taking actions against China, China's taking actions against us, but we are so heavily reliant. Actually, you know what? I have one more question for you.
Sure.
We are so heavily reliant on China. Is there anything besides like the IP that China is reliant on the United States for in terms of materials?
Material. I think it's the semiconductor equipment, but that is with the IP, right? So
Yeah, yeah, and that's even Dutch, right, and European manufactured, I
yeah,
think, some of it, so,
yeah.
yeah.
So I mean, they need that, but we keep blocking them. But
Yeah, but well, then they're re-engineering it, right? So
yeah.
it's,
I always say it's a matter of time. So that's
yeah.
why, like, on our upstream side, we need to figure out just as quickly how to get out of this with using the trade policy and the domestic production. Again, domestic production is the long game, the trade policy is the short game, because once they get the know-how for that, they're gonna move light years ahead. They'll be totally vertically integrated. All the processed, inputs there with the semiconductor, chips, both on the foundational and advanced chips, and they will just steamroll ahead, and leave us all in the dust, and that's a scary position to be. But I am very positive that we can find a way out. Yeah.
Well, maybe we won't need semiconductors when we have gravity manipulating plasma
Yeah,
orbs,
sure.
but that's probably more than 30 years out, I'd say.
Yeah.
Um,
That's
hey,
a different episode of Elevated Thoughts.
we'll link it.
Send me that when it's done. So
Mahnaz, thank you so much. Hey, where can people find you or reach out or see some of your work?
sure. My email, I'm on LinkedIn, and you can also follow our page, Silverado, www.silverado.org, or on LinkedIn. We love having more and more followers. I think we've doubled since I've joined. And then, yeah, all our work is on our website. But yeah, if you have any questions, and I love talking to the companies in this space, so feel free to email me as well. So thank you so much for
Awesome.
having me so late.
Of course, our pleasure.
Yeah, this was awesome. And this has been Elevated Thoughts.